Hello, and welcome to the HiddenLayer webinar, Operationalizing AI Governance, Managing Risk in Autonomous AI Systems. We want to thank you for joining today. I'm John Smith. I'm the Vice President of Strategic Technical Alliances at HiddenLayer. I'm very happy to bring this panel to you today. We have some really heavy hitters from the industry, some impressive careers in cybersecurity, and probably more experience on governance than you're going to get just about anywhere. So I'd like to turn this over to the panel and let them introduce themselves, and then be off to the races on this interesting topic that I'm sure is at the top of everyone's mind today in the age of autonomous AI. Malcolm, do you want to start?
Yeah, hi, I'm Malcolm Harkins, Chief Security and Trust Officer with HiddenLayer, and I think again this is going to be a great discussion. I know myself, I've been around corporate governance stuff for pushing 30 years, way back into my days at Intel. So it'll be interesting to see where we go with this.
Hi, everybody. Gary McCallum, pleasure to be here. Had a military career in cybersecurity, served at USA as their Chief Security Officer, then AIG as their Global CISO. More recently, working as a Senior Advisor for Cyber with Oliver Wyman Global Consulting. And guess what comes up in many of the cases that we work? Governance, particularly around AI. So this is a great timely topic.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Juan Gomez Sanchez. I am currently the Vice President of Cyber Resilience for McLean Company, a Berkshire Hathaway portfolio company, supply chain logistics. Glad to be here. Glad to actually bring my almost 30 years of experience as a practitioner, right? Trying to actually lead with not only just governance, but governance in the age of AI, right? And in this big problem that we have in front of us. I've been in many industries. I actually typically convey the value of governance as a measure, right, of our capabilities from a cyber resilience today, but in the past as a cybersecurity function. And glad to be here to actually discuss the topic with my fellow co-panelists.
Fantastic. Malcolm, I think I'm going to start by pointing out that you've written quite a bit on this topic already. You wrote something recently called Decision Without Division, Governance in the Age of AI. And I've got all sorts of highlights in here. But one of the key things I think that's on everybody's mind is that the environment has fundamentally changed. I think maybe we start with that and how that impacts what kind of decisions we have to make, what we can trust, what we can't trust, how that's changed. And then from that, there's a lot we can pivot into.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Some of this dates back even, like I said, quite a while for me. Back 20 plus years ago, I wrote an initial article on IT governance way back in my Intel days. And governance for me has always been about decision rights and decision oversight and the accountability and that type of stuff. And it starts with corporate governance, then you have IT governance, cybersecurity governance, and AI governance is this thing that kind of binds them almost all together, because particularly as we move to agentic systems and autonomous systems, and they're making decisions, you got to go, how do I have decision assurance over the decision rights, right? And that, to me, becomes a fundamental thing versus chasing a governance tool. Let's go get the foundation and the pillars of what establishes the decision making, the decision rights, the decision assurance, and then the controls around all that. And if you don't do that, frankly, you have faux governance, in my opinion.
I would say it's always been hard, though, right? Like, the difficulty in governance has never gone away. Like, the tools have accounted for it a little bit better, but it's always a challenge, right? And I think that part of that is understanding what the systems are that you're working with. And I often see that there's a disconnect. Like, you can try to do governance, but if you don't understand the systems really well, that kind of breaks the whole model to begin with. So now we've got this whole new technology that is, how do we put it, like stochastic, right? It's not guaranteed to operate the same way, but we're so reliant on it, right? So that changes this whole framework. But then there's a curious part, right? You mentioned, the decision-making rights. Well, are we already being influenced in our decision-making when we go into ChatGPT, we put something in about governance? Like, are we already being influenced? Are they already making decisions for us even before they've been implemented into a system? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that, and then we can jump right into, like, well, how scary is the implementation?
John,
I think it depends upon how much we're relying upon the system, right? And whether or not we're getting automation bias because we trust the output of it, right? Versus it's providing decision assistance versus decision making, right? And both of those things have implications on us as humans, and then the governance of the AI, the governance of the company and its operations, depending upon the context of the use.
Yeah. The one thing that I would like, if I may, John, real quick, is, when you think about traditional governance, it really was built for deterministic systems. I think that's a point you were making.
Exactly.
And AI is fully probabilistic. It is adaptive. It's constantly changing, right? And then you match that to how the adoption, right, is outpaced the speed of governance, right? By the time you write a policy, by the time you actually gather the governance functions, it's already in production. It's, people have already used it. People, so it is the velocity as well that is actually making governance, the traditional governance approach, is actually somewhat ineffective, right?
Yeah. I would just, let me double tap on all of that. I came out of banking, and I recall, dealing with, the model risk management team and enterprise risk, every year, annual reviews and certifying models, right? I had the fraud team. And so all of those were, deterministic models, right? Very predictable, right? Input in, input out, right? And yeah, check, you win. This world of AI is so different, right? That the traditional model risk management approach it doesn't apply, right? And when I think about scope, scale, impact of AI behavior that you're trying to govern, I'm going to get into the how bad it is type of perspective. But when it comes to this world, right, most organizations, they don't know what models they're running in the first place. They have no visibility. They don't know what data they're touching. They don't know what decisions they're influencing, or maybe they don't know all the decisions are being influenced. They're not sure how they behave under stress or attack. They don't know about configuration drift, right? And so when you think about all these elements, right, of this new world, the traditional model is not going to work. The traditional IT observability tools are not going to work. So it is a significant challenge, right, by far.
Yeah, I would double down that the scale and velocity of everything today versus 10 years ago, it's night and day. It's like a totally different world that we live in. I think it almost begs the question, like, how do you deal with something that's constantly changing? How do you deal with something that has this velocity that's asymptotic, right, with regard to capability or where it's going to be put into systems? We see this everywhere now. It's on endpoints. I got an upgraded phone the other day from Google, and I'm like, what is this downloading? It's downloading some massive something, and it turns out it was a model, so that all of this kind of control or ability or whatever feature set they have, it's all happening on the endpoint, which was really interesting. I'm thinking this is everywhere now, whether we are aware of it or not. Mm-hmm. I think that's a double-edged sword, though. Something that's very interesting that I ran into in governance, and I didn't mention this in the intro, but I'm a former multi-stop CISO and worked in threat intelligence and some of the AI security startups, and a number of things, right? So, but what I've found is that, and what I'm thinking of is that AI can be a huge help in governance, because it gives us the ability to, like, you never had enough people to do the governance work well. You never had enough people with necessarily like a good technical understanding of what was being built. So we do have these systems now that have the opportunity to look in and tell us, hey, this is probably the right thing to apply to this system. So I think that's a huge boon. But then I think the question comes down to, again, that stochastic nature, and what does that mean in the applications that are built with it? They're not utilizing the AI for the governance help, but also the concept that I think has arisen even in the marketing field right now. I was talking to our chief marketing officer about what happens when the whole world is just trying to influence AI, so that the AI decides that you should buy this thing, or you should use this thing, or you should use this software. So we've really entered this age that even in the non-malicious, or you can argue it one way or the other, non-malicious use cases, the attempt is that everyone is going to be trying to manipulate the AI, right? The AI that's in the software.
We've done with search engines, right?
Exactly.
The context of the response we get back, we think we over trust it, because it's not just giving us a list of things from a search, it's giving us an answer, right? And if we treat it like the magic 8-ball, if I shake it the right way, it's going to tell me what to do.
Correct.
Yes, that, and in an application, let's say we've got one that comes under audit, Sarbanes-Oxley applies to it, who knows what, and you're taking inputs from outside, right? That anytime you have that input from outside, there's an opportunity for manipulation. There's an opportunity for prompt injection. There's an opportunity for fraud. And that, I think, comes down to one of the bigger questions here. You mentioned a number of things that I'm going to pick on here, but in your paper, but one of it is trust. How do you prove that the output is the output you expect, that the model works the way you want to? I think that opens a whole can of worms for governance, right?
Well, it absolutely does. And I think, again, depending upon the context of the model, roll back the clock a couple decades ago. And Juan and Gary and I have enough gray, to remember the early days of things like Sarbanes-Oxley, right? And then the implication of that for corporate governance, for the financial team, the application side, and then into the infrastructure. And I remember having to chase down Excel files that were used for determining WIP in manufacturing, determining forecasts for international exchange rates and all that stuff. And we had to put controls around the models themselves and validation of the formulas in the models in order to attest to their input into critical things that caused changes on the line items on the balance sheet or the income statement. Okay, well, take that in the context of an AI model that's helping determine or give you the same things, because it's no longer in an Excel sheet. I'm using an AI model to help in that determination. And some of it may be the deterministic models, but some of it is the interface is going to be a generative model, because I'm leveraging that to do scenario playing to help me then forecast something or make a determination of things, because it's managing workflows and connected into other systems. I'm like, how do you, again, validate that the model itself has integrity and has enough security around it that no manipulation or mistake occurred, and I'm relying on it for something that's material to corporate reporting?
Yeah. Hey, Malcolm, that really makes me think as you're describing it. And, we talk about this casually, but it's so important in this space, right? I think about the world of fraud when I owned those responsibilities, right? We were totally dependent on our fraud models and behavior patterns and transactions and geographical location, right? But all deterministic models, right? In this world, right? The beauty is on the positive side, you can react to changing circumstances with new context and get a more accurate model, right? And that could also, again, be manipulated or influenced in a negative way. But I think what this really speaks to is this need for this continuous monitoring, right? And having a sense of parameters, right, and thresholds, because is the model performing as expected, right? Is it operating within what you would expect to be reasonable parameters, right? And if you're not watching that continuously, the amplification problem of this technology and the scale is going to be catastrophic in some cases. So it really speaks to maybe not new requirements, but just the double down on this whole concept around monitoring. Because if you're not able to react to deviations or anomalies that you don't expect, the scale of impact, right, can really be significant.
And that's where, if I may, that's where actually the old model breaks, right? When you think about governance from a very high level perspective, we're thinking about accountability models, rules of behavior, if you will. But those are very valid almost always just in the context of being compliant. You brought up Malcolm's Sarbanes-Oxley, right? In the past, had very specific rules. I mean, I'm sure it's happening right now. In fact, I know it's happening. People are using AI to actually create pricing models, right? For how much am I going to sell this thing in the market, right? And that that drives back as to, hey, how am I going to prove that that was the right price according to my rules, regulations, and business modalities, if you will, in which we're working. And in the world of AI, that accountability model, that process, and all those type of things in terms of compliance is actually pretty hard, right? So as you build all these governance models that are traditional, that actually ensure to some degree or assure compliance, I don't think this works anymore. I don't think those methods, again, going back to deterministic systems versus the ones that naturally were drift through time, right? And give you, that's why, Gary, your point is very valid, right? We have to monitor the models. Are the models drifting? And if the models are drifting or creating hallucinations, how much do we trust that data to be able to actually go and justify decisions that drive compliance, right? That's the challenge, I think, from a very high level perspective. It's not necessarily whether we do governance or we don't governance. Believe me, organizations are going to continue doing structured governance the way we actually do it for everything else but AI, and apply those same rules. And I think that the industries are actually going to get into a hole when those things don't meet the regulations that are bound to actually follow, right? I just can't wait. That's going to be that's going to be proven in court of law sometime soon, right? I made the right decision because AI told me to do that, and therefore, the company lost 20% value. Oh, okay. Where is that, right? How do we move past that problem?
That's not working in the courts right now, that approach, right? So it's failing miserably when it does happen. Something else that was brought up too that I think is interesting, Gary, you had mentioned fraud, right? And so there's this little kind of teacher's trick you ask people, like, what's the optimal amount of fraud? Is it zero? And the answer, the answer is not zero. The answer is there is some decreasing utility that happens when you try to approach zero fraud. So I wonder, as we move into this, I'll just say this stochastic world, because if you think about what we're doing in quantum physics and what we're doing in all these other places in the technology that we have today, it's all very stochastic based, right? We have some probably percentage of outcomes that aren't good that are okay for us if we understand the systems well and we expect that to be the case, right? We do that, we model that with a number of things. But back to Juan's point, though, there are compliance requirements, there are regulations that must be followed very strictly. And in those cases, I don't know that we can be trustworthy. Maybe we can use AI to augment our understanding or augment that search you were talking about, Malcolm, of figure out where in the pile of documentation, in the developer notes, and how they, what do the log data mean in an application that we don't know anymore because the guy left that was here for 20 years. Mm-hmm. Like those things, I've run into those a million times. But man, I wish I had, something that had already crawled all that I could just get answers from. So I think there's this augmentation perspective of it that works well. But at the end of the day, I don't think we're going to be in a place, and I could be wrong about this, where, we're going for zero fraud, we're going for zero deviation on these models.
You're totally right, Don. I mean, I'll date myself. You go, back into the 80s, I was in the retail credit industry for a number of years before I went to graduate school. And when I ran and managed May department stores selling California credit operations, we maximized the net income and we maximized revenue with 2% bad debt. Half of it was people couldn't pay their bills and half of it was true fraud. But I was playing with credit authorizations, in some cases daily, to maximize revenue and net income, all with a conscious effort to have 2% bad debt, which included, a chunk of fraud. And you go, okay, now that actually was good corporate governance because we had the thresholds and we managed to it, right? And we had controls around that to put on the brakes or put on the gas relative to the risk. The question becomes how, in that context, how do you do that around a model? How do you play with the pressure points of lessening control and tightening control relative to the context of the behaviors of the model? Getting back to Gary's point, you can't do that without the continuous detailed behavior and security management around the models and the agents.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting you say that because security and hallucinations and all of these things, they're all table stakes for models now, right? Like, I think a lot of developers understand this, that it used to be that security was like a security team will come in afterwards, kind of, agent on the machine, obviously agent in a different context back then. and there'll be some controls on the network, and then that's it. And then maybe we'll patch something if it comes along. We're out of that now. Like the whole system is the model with all these tendrils into different things, and how we put it in context, right? So I think that idea about continuously monitoring, but I think the other part is understanding what those deviations will be, because you can't make a mental model or even a regulatory model without a knowledge of how a system works. I used to work in the nuclear industry. We could not regulate at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission without fundamentally understanding the design of a nuclear power plant and how the operators were going to operate there. And we applied risk the same way. It was usually a dollar figure or some denial of an area of operation, land if something happened. And we had no accidents. But the reason that we had no actual nuclear accidents post 3 Mile Island was specifically because there was this regulation that was based on total understanding of the system. Now we've got a system that we don't have total understanding of. So we have to model that differently, and we have to put some kind of technology around it, right? To make sure that the inputs are not manipulating it and the outputs aren't. And that even reminds me of like a situation I was in where I had an auditor come in, a publicly traded company, and they said, "You're not allowed to have access to that system." I said, "Well, why? You could manipulate the system." Now we're in a situation where I can sit on the outside of the system, not have access to it, and I can still manipulate the system if there is AI in that system. That's a fundamentally different change. That is a absolutely fundamentally different change. And I can manipulate that by putting something out on the internet that I know to look at.
Yeah. So one interesting thing you actually said is that, then where do we inject ourselves in this ecosystem of AI, right? To be able to actually go and be the most effective. And I think this concept of runtime control is where most organizations need to be actually looking at. But I'm also going to date myself and go back to, 10, 15 years, right? In which we were actually talking about how do we catch bad people doing bad things, this whole concept of UEBA, right? Behavioral analytics, right? Where you see, outliers. And I believe that we're going to have to recover all that lost knowledge because it somehow got lost in translation. And I do still believe that insider threat and the ability to be able to actually go and understand, in this case, amplification drift and hallucinations at runtime is truly the only practical way of actually ensuring controls that things are not going the wrong way, if you will, right? But that whole behavioral analytics, right? Assuming that agents take on your identity, which is, by the way, another problem that we probably need to talk about, right? And with the same rights and perspectives and access to data and all those things, right? That, as we understand it, through prompt injection and poisoning can actually be broken out. So again, the point here that I'm making is runtime controls, right? Not just necessarily as to how do we set up the infrastructure and the capabilities and the APIs, but the actual runtime controls. And the other one is start building the capacity and capability at velocity to be able to actually go and understand when something is going wrong, right? And I think that that's a challenge for the industry, right? We have to actually get through those two things. The traditional things, by the time we actually establish policies and procedures, it's too late, right? It's a reactive measure rather than the runtime measure.
It's interesting you say that, because also that speed and scale, it puts a pressure on the number of people you have on a cybersecurity team and a governance team, right? I was talking, I can't mention their name because it's probably insider information to some extent, but if you talk to a number of hyperscalers, a lot of their security operations are fully autonomous at this point in time. And because it's just impossible to deal with the scale. With people, you'd have to hire a ridiculous number of people to deal with it the traditional way. And so what they're doing is they're validating the outputs of the system afterwards, right? They're validating that the right actions were taken, and maybe they were or they weren't from the autonomy. But those are a mixture of systems that are both stochastic in some way, AI based, but also deterministic to make sure that only certain actions can flow and certain data can get in and out and whatnot. So I think the real answer at the end of the day is that you probably have a mixture of deterministic and stochastic systems that are checking in real time on these things. Some will work really well and fast, others might be a little slower.
Yeah, hey, John, that's a great point. And somebody asked a question in the chat room, I think it was Steve, and I think it's a great point. We talk about trust. I don't know. I agree. I don't think trust is the right word here, right? In terms of we trust something that's so binomial, yes or no. I do think the context is more confidence based, right? Based on data, right? Based on data, based on behavior, based on validation process, we have a high confidence. I don't know if we can ever in this world say, yeah, we trust this model, right? I think that is going to be a paradigm that people should really look closely at. Sitting in a decision-making seat, I would never say I trust that model. I would say I have a high confidence. It's like, are you secure or not? We're in the risk management framework, we would never answer yes or no. We'd say, we're managing risk, right, to an acceptable level. So I do think that in the context of this conversation, I do think confidence is a right way to talk about this.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right, and I'm glad Steve brought that up, because it's interesting, right? Because we've batted around in the industry now for 10 plus years this notion of responsible AI or trustworthy AI and stuff like that, and it has all these things around non-bias and discrimination and transparency, and all those things are good. But to your point, if you don't have confidence that the model is operating within the expected behaviors and parameters, and you can detect and contain and mitigate issues that may be occurring and attacks that may be occurring on the models, you don't have any confidence in it. So therefore, how can it be responsible or trustworthy?
It's interesting you say that, because at the end of the day, the main thing that you can trust when you look at a model is the model card, if it's been validated appropriately. And the model card will tell you it hallucinates at this rate. It has been trained for this sort of thing. We call it trust. I think one of the problems we have in the space, and probably it's because of a lot of marketing talk, is we anthropomorphize these models, right? We talk about them like they're humans, like they think. They're very complex text prediction machines in this massive hyperplane of data. It's wholly impressive. But I can tell you, I'm going to date myself too. Back in like late 80s, early 90s, on a floppy drive, I could plug this thing in from like an Amiga magazine into my Amiga when I was a kid. And there was like a chatbot one Christmas, that came out. That thing, it was almost convincing that it was a living, breathing thing sitting behind the computer. And this is, back in the days of like woefully awful compute ability. So as humans, we tend to look at things, we see faces in the moon and everything like that. And we're doing this, but we need to step back and remember, like, this is a artificial neural network with some transformers in it, in a black box that has a stochastic delivery mechanism. And like, if we remind ourselves that that is the truth, and we understand how it's been trained, but that requires all of us, and I think especially people in governance, especially people that are CISOs, to understand, like, what are the attack vectors? How do these things actually behave? What should my expectations be? Because there is so much hype about what they can do, and it's so darned impressive. I mean, it's really impressive. But at the same time, the limitations are absolute. You couldn't take an LLM and say, go drive my car right now, a text model. It would have no world model to understand. It doesn't know that you're going to be in trouble if it tells you something wrong for governance. It's just trying to find, it's trying to please you, right? It's the intern. Malcolm, do you remember that quote, by the way, at the CSO conference? I know a couple of us were there.
I'm vaguely, my mind was going to you're dating yourself and floppy disk when you were a kid, and I'm like, man, I was already in a corporate job then. But no, you're right. There was some comment there that I'll try and remember it, but it was a really great. It's like they're teenagers or something, right?
Yeah, you have an intern that's working for you that's not out of college yet, that has root access to everything, that wants to please you more than anything, and they have an honesty problem. Like I think it was something along those lines.
I have the exact quote because I did a screenshot. It said, agents are interns with root access, infinite patience, and no fear of HR.
Yeah, there you go.
That's the one.
Agents are interns with root access and no fear of HR.
Yeah. That's what we're dealing with. Those are our trusted employees that are sitting behind the door in the black box in the system.
Well, and let's not forget let's not forget that there'll be 1,000 interns per person. So,
Well, again, it's back to your point on the UEBA, Juan, and the fact that we need to think of these agents as insiders, right? And the potential, and we all know, insider in the wrong space can be the most devastating form of attack. At this point, though, there's a real human that's the insider. Now I have this agent that could be manipulated by an external thing or an attacker, or an internal person, or both. And again, we talked about the speed and the scale. If you think of these, and Jason Martin and our research team had thought about this a couple of years ago, and we need to be thinking of agents as, in essence, probably the worst type of insider we could ever have, because of that, the externalities and the inputs and outputs that could alter what they're doing.
Yeah.
Well, think about us. Go ahead, Juan. Sorry.
Just one quick thing, right? All very real. I also add the fact that AI doesn't need to be hacked to cause harm, right? It can produce incorrect, unsafe outputs, if you will, while functioning as designed, right? So there is that plus that whole perspective as to whether we should or shouldn't, through confidence level, which I appreciate that feedback, trust or not trust, right? But anyway, it's interesting how the world is changing in multiple dimensions just by this whole concept. But
Hey, John, maybe I want to circle back because it made me think when Malcolm was talking at the beginning, right? I think all of this is really this whole concept around operational impact, right? And oversight and quality of the confidence that you have. I think, and what I've seen in my experience is one of the big gaps today is around AI governance is around ownership. Like, everyone assumes that somebody else owns the AI risk, right? From what I've seen. Data teams think security owns it. Security thinks the product team owns it. Product thinks legal's on. There are a lot of stakeholders involved, but I think this concept of AI without the race being clear on AI ownership, this becomes an AI problem without guardrails, and that leads to all the issues that we've been talking about today. So it seems like a really simple problem to solve up front for any organization, but it really is the root of everything that comes after that, in my opinion.
That's a really good point. And I had this random conversation the other day about getting a license as a PE, professional engineer. I remember right after college, I took my engineering training. I had the experience and the requirements to get a PE. I never did it because if I signed something, I would be legally liable for anything I designed, right? And if it had to do with health and or human systems or bridges or anything like that, that would be, it's just something I didn't need to take on the risk unnecessarily. I didn't have use for it in my job. But at the same time, if you think about what that means, like where does that liability shift in that context, in highly regulated environments? It's to the designer, right? It's all the way left to the person that you either designed it or you're the one that signed the design. And so I think in terms here, we talked a little bit about education before, understanding how this works. If you're a builder, if you're a developer, you're an application architect, like you need to know and understand the behavior of the component you're putting into the system. I feel like that's the responsibility. This is my personal opinion, right? Like I don't think this is necessarily the answer, but that needs to be there. If you take and say, I think Tesla had this problem. You design a control, an arm that supports the wheel and the suspension and everything on a vehicle, and you woefully undersize it. Like you're responsible for having done that in a car accident that might occur or death that could occur from that sort of thing. Like that was a bad design decision. And so I think a lot of it is the responsibility of the people that should be in the know designing systems to have this kind of virtuous loop of making sure that the people that are doing or running compliance, running risk, understand what that risk is. And there's a famous story about a guy that said, hey, we've got to migrate all this stuff. Well, what's the chance of an outage happening during that? Less about 0.5%, 1%. That's a huge, like that's a really large number if you're familiar with statistics. But if you don't deal with them on a daily basis, like you might think that that's just totally fine.
Yeah,
So,
and you know what? And I agree with what you said, but I'm not sure that the liability is going to shift left, right?
I don't think.
Yeah, it should, but look at where we've been legacy wise, right? Software comes out with bugs. Sometimes organizations get hacked because of it. 0 days. I do think the model developers and are going to have to become more helpful, right, in how we validate their models and their capabilities to a reasonable sense of confidence. But I just think the liability, the accountability balloon's going to bounce around here, right? People are not going to.
I shouldn't have said it that way, but I think I'm more thinking in terms of like shifting left in the software development lifecycle.
Yeah, but the challenge we've got, we should shift left, but we operate right.
Yes,
exactly right.
Yeah.
Using a physical analogy, and I'll put the two things together. And John, I'll bring to your engineering thing. Let's use a construction analogy. I'm building a high rise, anything above 10 stories, that has to have construction parameters for earthquakes because I'm building in San Francisco, wind shear because I'm building in Chicago or Miami, snow load because I'm building in Minneapolis, whatever. I've got to have the structural engineering to withstand the tolerances of wind shear, ground movement, and snow load, right? You go, okay, great, you've done all that. But guess what? Shit happens. And I think on the operate right, it's what's the equivalent of the smoke detector, the fire alarm, the fire suppression system, and the evacuation route to preserve and protect life and minimize damage to the building because of that stuff. And that doesn't even equate to the potential physical acts of terrorism or an active shooter or something like that. And you go, okay, we have to shift left, but we operate on the right hand side. And so that's where, again, I think it gets back to that confidence thing and the resistance to and resilience from issues in the production environment that will occur. And so I think we have to do both and bring it back to governance. Unless you're doing and can demonstrate both are occurring, you don't have governance over AI.
So I think that's really a good point. And as we're about 7 minutes, 6 minutes in before what we'd like to do for Q&A, I think we had 15 minutes set at the end of this. I think that's a good place to pivot. I'm looking at this paper you wrote because I highlighted it all over it. I thought it was a great paper. There was a section here towards a little bit further in called validation, proving controls work. And so I think one of the things we talk about here is like, what can you do? What are actual things that you can put in place right now to make sure these models are doing what they're doing, knowing what the models will do, how they'll behave, and so on and so forth. And you have a list here, but I think I'll toss it back to the panel here to talk about what can we do today specifically. What technologies can we apply? How can we ensure that these systems are operating the way we think they should, and proving to us that we have the right controls in place in this whole world of governance and trustworthiness, if we want to use that term.
Hey, Juan, it may start, we were having a dialogue earlier around, some of the stuff that you were putting together to kind of pictorialize it. I think that actually laid out, that flow, if you want to share, conceptually where you were going with that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll directly from your paper, I think, because these are right. One is penetration testing. I mean, that's been table stakes for all sorts of systems, but I think when you think about penetration testing, the other one is adversarial attack simulation, red teaming of AI systems, scenario-based stress testing. I think these systems really need to be tested in all different scenarios that we can think of to validate that it will behave the way that we expect it to behave, right? And so that we can, because one of the things that changes in these models is that they are designed to be plugged into context, right? Once they have a context, they behave differently on inputs and outputs. And without that context, you just have like a model card, right? It's this super generic thing that's not going to tell you the behavior in the context. So if we have context, we technically have intent, but we can't trust intent. In your papers say like trusting intent's not good enough. static validation is not good enough. You actually have to test these things. So, my argument would be that one, the testing and relatively continuous testing, right? Something that should be happening regularly, and giving you useful outputs from that. The other side of this is protecting the inputs and the outputs. And you look at the system and you say, well, the input is where the manipulation occurs, right? Whatever comes into that system, whatever that LLM looks at can be a form of manipulation or jailbreak or so on and so forth. But then on the output, where a lot of the industry is focused is trying to control what things can be touched, whether or not you can drop tables in databases, what you have access to, so on and so forth. But I think stopping that as it comes out of the LLM, recognizing that it is deviated or it's doing something that should have never been intended given the context of what it does, I think those are key places to get in personally. It also happens to be what we do as a company here that's sponsoring the webinar, but obviously we think that's really important and an important part of ensuring that those models operate the way we would expect them to behave after we put them in place. So I think getting close. I don't know if you guys can see the Q&A section. It's up on my screen. I haven't had a chance to go through it. Is there anything that pops out to the panel here that would be interesting to answer?
There's a question by HUD addressed to me. So let me see if I can answer it best I can. Right. So he says, for Juan, operational resilience, when autonomous agents drift beyond expected mandate compliance, how granular are your agent scopes, and who has the authority to suspend an agent mid-ops without breaking something upstream? Very good question, and one that I believe that we're going to be struggling quite a bit. Right. I do believe that today, as things stand, I don't think you can bypass a human in the loop, for critical operations. You still need to actually have that. That's first. The second thing is actually was answered in a prior question. You have to actually build confidence models, right, that allow you to actually make better determinations on what the output of a model does, right? And if you make those decisions and get somebody in the middle to be able to actually go and make human decisions at the end of the day, and I know it slows down things. It's not, but for critical things that imply resilience for business, I don't think we're ready for that yet, right? That would be my best answer, but I would love to hear what Malcolm and Gary have to say about that, right? I just don't trust it enough to make business critical decisions today, right? Because of all the things that we've talked about and the lack of governance and the lack of potential compliance and doing all those type of things, I think we'll get better over time. Don't take me wrong. I think that this is just a point in time today. Human in the loop is still important.
Yeah, well, I'll give a different analogy, and I'll circle back to it, because I think you're right. But it kind of gets back to, there was a book Stephen Covey Jr. wrote years ago called The Speed of Trust. You get velocity when you trust stuff, right? Because then you can just keep moving. Again, a dated analogy, back in the early 90s, I worked for Frito-Lay. The first chip company I worked for, in this case, potato chips, not semiconductor chips. But I remember back doing auditing of their systems and stuff like that. And even back then, as the conveyor belt of chips was going, they had cameras and things that they would use to determine whether or not there was a piece of metal or glass or something wrong with the output of potato chips. And they would stop a line, and it would be an automated stop of the line, relying upon the systems to determine there was an error or an issue, and you'd stop the entire manufacturing line, right? So we've already been doing that type of reliance on technology to make decisions, again, in a deterministic world like we've talked about. So the question just becomes, again, how do we get the decision assurance over the models so that we can do the same thing? Because the business will want that, because it'll add speed and velocity. So it's incumbent upon the security team, again, to get into the weeds, get into the controls, have that granular understanding of the model behaviors, and that you can manage and mitigate attacks and other issues, because the business wants that. Right. And so, again, I think, again, if we use other analogies of systems and where we've turned that over before, we should be able to do it again with the right level of security controls around the systems.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting you say that, because it ties into the next question that's on here, actually, from Aaron P. He says, it seems like there should be more focus on the deterministic controls around the models, such as how they're built in the harness, for example. And it's interesting because I look at that and I think about when I was at Nielsen, a really bright CISO brought me in and had me run AppSec across the businesses. And we realized there was huge disconnect between what the builders were doing and security, and it somehow needed to be figured out. And so it's very much a sort of a shift left thing, but we became consultants. We made sure that we had the knowledge and experience that we needed to come in and make sure early on in that design process, early on in the ideation around like this new product or platform that we were going to build, that we would have that security in place, and it would be appropriate. It would be appropriate to what was being built. I think when you think about AI models today, most of the amazing stuff we're seeing, whether using Claude Code or other things, the models are certainly getting better, but it's actually the harnesses that are around them that are enabling them to do that. And so it also starts to remind me of, and because any one of these solutions might be right, but if you think about, what was it, Netflix that had the paved road model? They basically said, hey, listen, like, we've got all this infrastructure that's going to support what this plugs into. It's a repeatable pattern. It has the controls in place. What we find when we're interacting with companies is a lot of the companies that are doing this right have already thought through those and built essentially what looks like a harness or their own MCPs or other things that have all these questions answered. Sometimes they're bringing in third-party companies, certainly for the security aspect, but oftentimes if they've got capable builders inside, they're building the platforms in which to put these and improving them over time, and they have that pattern. So
you're making the point, like I was using the construction analogy.
exactly.
We're making sure that it's constructed right, but we're also specing the smoke detector, the fire alarm, the fire suppression, and the evacuation routes. The shift left, but we operate right. And unless in the focus on shifting left, we're defining the operate right security controls, it's not going to be resistant to nor resilient from issues.
Hey, John, before, I know we're getting close on time, I don't want to pass up this question because I think it's a good one. It was by Anonymous. So much of our AI risk is stuff we didn't build. Foundation models, third-party tools, SaaS applications. How do you govern risk that you can't fully see into and you didn't choose? It's $1 million question, right? Listen, every security framework, right? The first pillar is always around asset management, asset inventory, right? This is it's not unlike that problem, right? Of, where is all your IT at? Where's all your IoT? Where are your APIs, et cetera, et cetera? I think this is a huge challenge because I think part of the problem is there's a disconnect on the language, right? The definition of AI has become very all-encompassing, and so stuff that used to be, machine learning, right, is, oh, we got AI, right? And so when you start looking at the volume of problem that you've got to deal with, right, and the lack of visibility into that, it's a huge challenge. I do think, in answer to the question, especially for third party, I think it's going to start with contract language and reporting requirements, right? I mean, and then you're going to have to be able to validate that over time. I do think there are technology tools for within your own environment that are going to help you do data discovery, if you will. They'll be tied into attack surface management, I'm sure, at some point. But I do think it's going to be a combination of, contract, governance processes, and technology tools that are going to have to help with this. But is that solved today? I don't think it is, right? The whole inventory problem is a huge challenge up front.
Yeah, Gary, I would add to that, do not rely on SOC 2, ISO, HIPAA, PCI, any of those other things, even the NIST AI risk management framework. They are insufficient when it comes to the security controls that are really required to operate the models or the agent securely. You can't rely on any of those things. I would say that you need to ask your third-party providers that are embedding AI into things that you're using some very basic questions, right? How are they scanning the models to look for supply chain related stuff? How are they penetration testing the model? Have them demonstrate to you and share with you their AI incident response plan should the model or agent be tampered with. Ask them how they're detecting and responding to various types of things. And then I can tell you, again, a plug for HiddenLayer. Go take some of our research like policy puppetry, shadow logic, our tokenization attacks, and saying, how are you able to detect and mitigate these attacks that bypass guardrails? And if they can't answer that, and those models are being used in a function that creates potential material risk to your organization, you really have a problem at that point that you need to sort through with your vendor.
I think this brings something else up too that's interesting, that we've seen other like open source supply chain attacks and things happening so much recently that fortunately this has been started a little bit ahead of, I would say, the AI journey. So the idea that you can ask for a software bill of material, that's something that you can use with your SIM and you can use for discovery or find out if you're exposed to something. I would say, fortunately, we went through some of that in a very bad way before this kind of blew up. And that gave us these concepts that we're seeing that in the AI space, right? That you get an AI bill of material, HiddenLayer, we can scan for that, tell you exactly what the progeny is, where it came from, is it modified, does it have backdoors, things like that. I think that's critically important, and security teams have come to understand that's important, and builders have come to understand that it's important. But also, to answer this question, I'll go back to Gary's statement. It's hard, and it's turtles all the way down, because you've got it really is. Every one of those turtles has some different risk associated with it. You just don't know. It's a black box. You've got your vendors who might give you take it or leave it terms, like with the big players. The other thing is, if you don't want your data over there, well, that might require that you go up to the enterprise tier. Like everybody that's been in our seats at a company has dealt with, like, well, no, we got to go to the bigger tier because they're not going to give us these other assurances unless we do that. So I think going back to the legal language, contracts, whether you want to build something of your own, I can tell you for sure in the financial space, a lot of companies maintain their own open source repositories at a certain level, validated, and before they'll move to the next one, they're not going to take like the next version immediately. They're going to wait, they're going to test it, do their own testing, but not every company has those resources. So I think it goes back to this idea of, do you understand what you're building? Do you understand what the dependencies are? Do you understand what the risks are? And use that to inform the questions you ask your vendors, or the questions you ask in choosing a open source product or any kind of product on the market to build with. So
yeah, hey, I think your point though, John, I just double tap on that, right? You referenced HiddenLayer can do that discovery part of it. I know teams, early on, and this wasn't that long ago, where people are trying to do this manually, right? Track things in spreadsheets and things. You might start off like that. You will very quickly discover, right, this environment changes too much, and that is not a viable model. So this is where technology can help in a huge way.
Well, good point. Like, let's talk about some positives. One of the nice things, and I remember I used to ask this all the time at companies I work for, is like, what is the legal language you've agreed to in your 100+ business units that I now have risk for? The only way we can identify our risk is to understand what we've signed up for with regard to risk, right? I'm like, I want to know what my SLAs are for security for any problems we have with every company. And the legal team would look at me like I was a crazy person. They're like, do you know how much we would have to mine, how much data we would have to mine to even get a basic understanding? We live in an age right now where you could literally throw a model at that. And even if it's not 100% perfect, even if you can get 90%, you just did the work of like 100 full-time legal employees over a period of a month at some companies. You could get that done in hours, maybe even less. So there's a lot of benefit here that is really amazing in the space of security, compliance, and so on and so forth. But the problems, it's like the benefits are huge, but the problems are huge as well. Like, they seem to grow with each other. So we've got 5 minutes left. I'm wondering if there's any other questions or any final thoughts maybe anyone on the panel would like to put out there before we close.
I would say, John, that in terms of practical guidance, right? How do we deal with this governance model, right? And there's a couple of things that I think come to mind, and I think we probably want to do a roundtable to see what are the 2 or 3 things that we will leave out of board. I'll give you 2, for example, that I believe that are super important in this governance problem that we have in front of us. I think the first one is visibility and control, which you have to create that registry. There's no other way. Without visibility, you get nowhere, right? And that may mean different things to every organization, but getting that visibility soon. The second one, I think it's in the world in which velocity and volume are king, right? I do believe that the control needs to move to the runtime layer, right? I think it is super important to understand that you need to govern prompts, you need to govern outputs and actions, not just access, by the way. It's beyond that, to be able to actually go back and give some level of assurance, confidence, if you will, to the organization that we're actually doing the right things to do that. Otherwise, that without that runtime layer, I'm not really sure how we can actually work through the risk associated with leveraging AI for our business processes.
That's a really good point. And I think it actually reminds me of something that I learned through our research team. We have a very large research team here. They're absolutely incredible. But one of the things that they pointed out is that these models, and we're seeing this in real time, they follow instructions better, they get better at what they do. That's a really impressive thing. But in order to be generally usable, because we have this black box that we want to plug into all of these contexts, all these different things, right? And make them work. In order to be usable, like internal guardrails, internal capabilities of self-observation to ensure that they aren't hallucinating, aren't doing these other things, they don't really work well. And so there is an absolute need for a layer immediately at the ingest and the output part of these models to ensure to kind of cybernetically augment these models, because they aren't going to be able to be generally useful to everybody,
Right.
which is where the GDP or whatever we're going to call it that comes out of this stuff is. It's got to be external to it. It's like a rule that has evolved. The more usable, the less likely it is to be able to catch or control those issues internally. That may change at some point in the time. We're not seeing it anywhere in the near future or even far future based on how things are built today. But it's absolutely necessary.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for reminding me of that.
One thing I'll add, because we've spent a lot of time talking about the risk side, you walk back up to corporate governance. Corporate governance, besides managing risks and stuff like that, is oversight and assurance that the business has achieved its stated goals: revenue, gross margin, net income, market share, all that type of stuff, right? So, we have to look at this stuff as, my tagline, protect to enable. Our protection mechanisms are enabling the benefits of what AI is creating. And when you think of AI governance, both need to occur. You need to manage the risks, but you're managing the risk to be able to demonstrate you're getting the outcome that you've committed to as a business for the use of anything. It could be the construction of a manufacturing plant or the deployment of an AI model. The company has made an investment. The shareholders need governance to assure that there's going to be a return on that. And we can't lose sight of that when we talk about the risk issues.
Malcolm, that was an excellent close. I want to thank everybody for being here. I think we're right at time. We had an incredible panel. Like, what a privilege to be able to sit alongside these industry giants here in the cybersecurity world. Very good conversation. And I would say thank you to the audience for joining today. If you found this useful, please share with your friends and colleagues, and keep an eye out for future webinars. Again, I want to thank the team here. It's a real privilege to be here with you, and great conversation today. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
you